Okay, so you're faced with this, like, mountain of information, right? Articles, research, dense notes.
Hmm.
It's just a flood. How do you even begin to dig out what's really critical, especially from a huge foundational text? Something like Mises' Human Action.
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? There's so much depth, so many ideas all tangled together. Where do you even grab hold?
Exactly. And, well, that's our mission today. We're doing a deep dive into your source material from Human Action. And this thing, it's not just, an economics book. It's this massive work trying to build a whole system.
The whole way of understanding society, the economy, from the ground up, often starting from just one fundamental concept.
Right. And it's packed with these pretty profound insights. Stuff about individual choices, how societies are structured, even like why government intervention might cause problems.
So think of this as your guided tour. We're aiming to slice through the density, pull out the really key nuggets, see how they connect, maybe find some surprising things. The goal is to get you well informed on these core Misesian ideas pretty quickly and thoroughly.
And importantly, the source material doesn't treat these as just like abstract theories, does it?
No, not at all. It ties them directly into how we actually live, how we interact, the structure of our economic reality.
Okay, let's set the stage then. What's that one big idea? That foundation everything else is built on. The source calls it human action. So human action sounds, I don't know, simple, maybe obvious. But Mises, in this source, gives it a really specific, almost technical meaning right from the start.
He really does, yeah. According to the source, human action is fundamentally purposeful behavior. It's not just reacting instinctively, like, blinking. It's a conscious effort. You're trying to move from a state you see as uneasy to one you think will be better.
Okay, right. So, like, if I'm feeling hungry, that's the uneasiness. And I decide to go get an apple. That purposeful walk to the kitchen, getting the apple, that's action.
That's exactly it. You have an end, removing the hunger, and your choosing means walking, grabbing the apple to get there. Now, the science studying this, which the source calls praxeology.
Praxeology, that's a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But it just means the study of human action. And, importantly, the source stresses that praxeology isn't focused on the ultimate reasons, not why you were hungry or why you specifically chose an apple over, say, a banana, not the deep stuff like egoism versus altruism. Instead, it focuses purely on the means you use and how you rationally choose those means based on, well, the expected cost versus the expected result.
So it's about the logic of the choice itself, the strategy, kind of, not the deep psychology behind the want.
Exactly. The structure of the action, not the ultimate why. And this purposeful action is seen as completely tied up with human thought, with logic. The source argues our minds basically grasp reality in two ways. Causality, standard cause and effect.
Right.
And teleology, which is this idea of purposeful behavior, action directed towards goals.
Cause and effect and purpose.
Got it.
So if something doesn't fit into one of those two frameworks, we basically can't conceive of it.
That's the claim, yeah. And this leads to a really key distinction the source makes. Studying human action is fundamentally different from studying, say, physics or chemistry.
How's that?
Well, because understanding human action, the source says, requires and actually presupposes this praxeological knowledge, this understanding of purposeful choice. You can't analyze why someone bought, a particular stock using the same methods you'd use for a chemical reaction.
Right. Different domains.
Totally. Natural sciences look for causal, sort of mechanical laws. Praxeology looks at how conscious individuals choose means to achieve ends. So the source argues that trying to apply natural science methods to economics or history is, just inappropriate, fundamentally flawed.
That's a really big point the source keeps coming back to. And then there's this idea that praxeology is a priori. That sounds kind of heavy. What does that mean here?
Okay, a priori. Think of it like 2 + 2 = 4. You don't need to go into a lab and mix chemicals to prove that, right? You know it's true just through logic.
Right, just by reasoning.
Exactly. The source argues the basic principles of praxeology are like that. You can discover them just through correct reasoning about what action is, independent of any specific experiment or observation out in the world.
So it's not a theory you test empirically to see if it's true or false.
That's the argument, yeah. The source claims it just describes the logic of how action works and always has worked. Any attempt you make to even think about purposeful human behavior, whether you're, shopping or making policy, you're implicitly using this a priori reasoning. The structure of our minds, the categories of thought and action themselves, are seen as revealing the structure of reality, at least when it comes to human action. The source says there's no room for, agnosticism here. The truth is knowable through reason.
Wow, okay. So starting from the individual acting purposefully,
Yeah.
how does the source see something like, well, society emerging? Because, we often talk about society or the collective, like they're real things with their own minds.
And the source really pushes back hard against that. It states very clearly that society isn't some separate thing floating above us. It arises only from the actions of individuals. There's no social substance or group soul or anything like that.
So things like nations, states, churches.
They only become real, only discernible, in the actions of specific individuals. It's the specific things people do that constitute the collective, the group, society.
Okay, so society isn't like some giant creature. It's more like the complex pattern that forms from countless individual choices and interactions.
That's a good way to put it. Precisely. And this is where the source gets critical of what it calls holistic doctrines, ideas that view society as this independent thing with its own goals, maybe even goals that clash with individual goals.
Right.
The source argues these doctrines inevitably have to dish logical reasoning and fall back on, faith, metaphysics, sometimes even force, compelling individuals to sacrifice themselves for this abstract collective good. And that's often where you see charismatic leaders being treated as infallible instruments of the collective will or, historical destiny.
Okay, but if society is just individuals acting, why bother cooperating at all? Why not just go it alone? What's the incentive?
That's explained by what the source calls the law of association. The basic incentive is just higher productivity. It comes from the division of labor.
Specialization.
Exactly. When people specialize in trade, they can produce vastly more together than if each person tried to do everything themselves. And this cooperation, the source stresses, benefits everyone involved. Even if one person is, say, more talented overall than another, it still pays for both of them to specialize and cooperate. Every step towards more division of labor serves the interests of all participants.
So it's a win-win situation.
It's fundamentally seen as mutually beneficial, yes. It's based on the rational insight that working together makes the pie bigger for everybody. And here's a really crucial point the source makes. This whole system of cooperation, it doesn't rest on conflict or struggle. It rests on the conciliatory settlement of disputes.
On peace, basically, not war.
Yes, exactly. Peace is framed as the source of all social relations. Reason, the source argues, shows people that while aggression might satisfy an immediate urge, it destroys the cooperation needed to satisfy a whole range of other potentially more important desires. Choosing cooperation means choosing peace over violence.
Okay, so cooperation is rooted in rational self-interest and peace. But, people have hugely different worldviews, right? Different ideologies. Doesn't that mess things up?
The source acknowledges that, sure, people have different ultimate philosophies, different religions, whatever. But it argues that on the practical level, when it comes to earthly goals and the means to achieve them, there's often a surprising amount of uniformity if people are actually committed to human welfare and social cooperation. Meaning, for those people who share the basic goal of improving human well-being through cooperation, disagreements about social organization become essentially technical problems. They become questions about the most effective means and ways to achieve shared ends. And those technical questions can be analyzed by praxeology and economics. They're not necessarily clashes over fundamental, irreconcilable values.
So it's more about arguing how to get to a better place, assuming you agree on wanting to get there.
Pretty much for those who are committed to cooperation. And this leads straight into a really sharp contrast the source draws between two basic ways society can be organized. The contractual order versus the hegemonic state.
Okay, tell us about that contrast.
Right, so the contractual order is basically the rule of law, sometimes called the Rechtsstaat. Individuals are free to act, to make agreements within a clearly defined sphere of rights. It's based on voluntary exchange, mutual respect for property. The hegemonic state, on the other hand, which the source lumps together with the Wohlfahrtstaat, the paternalistic welfare state doesn't really have those limits. It operates through top-down directives, commands, regulations. Authority decides, and citizens, treated more like wards, just have to obey.
So voluntary cooperation under predictable rules versus command and control.
That's the core distinction the source is making, yeah.
Okay, building on this complex cooperation, this division of labor, The source really emphasizes something absolutely vital for it all to work.
Yeah.
Economic calculation. Why is that so crucial?
Well, think about it. In any economy beyond the most primitive Robinson Crusoe level, production is complicated, right? You've got countless steps, different resources, different kinds of labor, all contributing. You absolutely need a way to figure out if what you're doing actually makes sense.
If it's worth it.
Exactly. Economic calculation is the guiding star, the compass for action, especially production. It's how entrepreneurs figure out which production lines are profitable, meaning, consumers actually want the output enough to cover the costs, and which are unprofitable, meaning resources are essentially being wasted relative to other potential uses.
And how does this calculation actually work? What are you comparing?
It's fundamentally about comparing input and output. You're trying to figure out, hopefully, before you act, if the value of the resources and effort you put in is less than the expected value of the result. Or, looking backward, it's accounting profit and loss, cost versus yield. Did you create more value than you used up?
And the source claims that for a long time, economists kind of missed a key point about how this calculation is even possible.
This is a huge point in the source, yeah. It argues it was a major historical oversight. Economists just took economic calculation for granted, assumed it could always happen. But the source argues, no, it's only possible under very specific conditions. And the absolute key condition, the existence of money prices, especially for the factors of production land, labor, capital goods.
Money prices are the essential tool. You need them.
According to the source, they are the only vehicle for economic calculation. Think about it. Without money prices, how do you compare the cost of, say, 10 hours of skilled labor versus a ton of steel versus the electricity needed to run a machine? They're totally different things physically.
Right. You can't just add them up.
Exactly. Money prices provide that common denominator. They let you reduce all these different heterogeneous inputs to a single unit, allowing you to compare their total cost to the expected money price of the final product.
And this leads directly to what the source calls the crucial and only problem of socialism.
The socialist calculation problem.
Yeah. Explain that.
Right. The source argues that in a genuinely socialist system, where the means of production, factories, land, resources are owned and controlled by one central authority, there's no market for those factors of production. People don't buy and sell factories or raw materials amongst themselves.
And therefore, no prices for them.
No genuine money prices, yeah. Which means the central planner, the director, has no way to perform that essential economic calculation. The source uses the example of building a house. The planner might know method A uses X amount of steel and Y amount of concrete and Z hours of labor, while method B uses different amounts. But without money prices for steel, concrete, labor, etc., how can they compare the total cost of method A versus method B?
They can't tell which one is more efficient, uses resources more wisely.
Precisely. They can't make a rational numerical comparison. All they have are physical descriptions. It's like trying to add apples and oranges and working hours. The source argues attempts to create quasi-markets or use fancy math don't solve this fundamental problem, because the whole point of socialism, in this view, is to eliminate the market and substitute the planner's will. You can't get market prices without a real market.
But wait, what about uncertainty? The future is always uncertain, right? Doesn't that mess up calculation anyway?
Just source definitely acknowledges that. All calculation happens looking towards an uncertain future prices, future costs, future demands. But that uncertainty is inherent in all action. The problem isn't the calculation system itself being faulty. The problem is that the future is unknown. Monetary calculation still provides the necessary compass, the best possible tool we have for navigating that uncertainty, especially if you avoid massive, unpredictable swings in the value of money itself.
Okay, so calculation is the compass, and you need money prices generated by the market for it to work. Let's talk more about how the source sees the market actually functioning.
Yeah, the source paints a picture of the market economy as being steered by the market process itself. There's no CEO of the whole economy telling everyone what to make or do. Instead, it's this dynamic interplay where individuals pursuing their own ends are guided by market signals, primarily prices into activities where they best serve the wants of other people.
So it coordinates everything without a central plan.
That's the idea. Within the market process itself, there's no compulsion other than the rules needed to prevent antisocial actions like theft or violence that would destroy cooperation.
Which implies a specific, limited role for the state.
Yes, the source sees the state's essential function as protecting life, health, and private property against force and fraud. By providing that security, it creates the framework, the safe space where the market can operate effectively.
The source uses this phrase, Anarchic production. Sounds a bit wild.
It sounds provocative, yeah. But anarchic here just means not ruled by a dictator. It's contrasting it with a centrally planned system. Production isn't directed from the top down. Individuals freely choose how to participate, where to work, what to produce or consume. It's the market process, guided by prices reflecting consumer wants, that brings order and coordination to all these seemingly independent anarchic efforts.
And who's ultimately in charge in this system?
Mhm.
The source has that great analogy, the penny ballot.
Right. It's a really vivid image. The market is compared to a continuous democracy, but instead of one person, one vote, it's every penny spent is a vote cast. Consumers, through their choices of what to buy and what not to buy, ultimately determine what gets produced, how much, and consequently, the prices of everything, goods, services, resources, even wages and salaries.
So every time I buy coffee, I'm voting for coffee production.
You are. Every penny spent sends a signal, influencing production processes. Consumers are described as sovereign.
Consumer sovereignty.
That's the term. In this view, entrepreneurs and capitalists aren't the bosses. They are more like agents, servants of the consumers. They only succeed and make profits if they correctly anticipate and efficiently satisfy what consumers want. If they guess wrong, they make losses and eventually go out of business.
And this market democracy is different from political democracy.
Yeah, the source draws a distinction. In politics, often only the majority view prevails. Minority preferences might get ignored. But on the market, every penny counts. Even niche demands can be met. A publisher might print poetry for a small audience and detective novels for the masses, as long as both groups are willing to pay enough to make it worthwhile. Any demand backed by purchasing power can potentially find a supplier.
Okay, consumers casting penny ballots, driving prices. Let's dig into value and prices a bit more. How do we choose?
Well, the ultimate source of it all, as we said, is the subjective value judgments of individuals, primarily consumers making choices. And these judgments aren't about measuring something objective, it's just preference. I prefer this apple to that orange, or I prefer having this car to having the money it costs. It's ordering, ranking.
A to B, simple preference.
Exactly. And market prices. They emerge from the interaction of all these individual preferences and choices playing out across the entire market. For any one person, the price they see for bread or gasoline seems like a given fact, right? A piece of data they have to adjust their own plans to. But that price itself is the outcome of everyone else's subjective valuations and actions.
And the source insists that action doesn't measure value like we measure length or weight.
Right, that's a key point. Action is about choosing between alternatives, ranking them. First choice, second choice, etc. There's no little utilometer in our heads adding up units of satisfaction. You can't really perform arithmetic calculations with subjective values. Concepts like total utility are only really meaningful in rare all-or-nothing choices, like choosing between, say, keeping all your horses or keeping all your cows. You choose one bundle over the other, but you don't assign a number to the total value of each.
And how does this tie back to praxeology's limits?
It just reinforces the idea that praxeology is value neutral about the ends people choose. It studies the logic of using means to attain chosen ends. It can analyze whether the means are suitable for the end, but it passes no judgment on whether the end itself is good, bad, noble, or silly. Those ultimate ends. They're subjective, they're just given as far as the economic analysis is concerned. That's ethics, not praxeology.
Let's switch gears a bit to labor, wages, capital, and living standards.
Okay. The source starts with something pretty basic. Work, labor, is generally seen as involving disutility, meaning it's somewhat unpleasant or requires effort we'd rather not expend. We prefer leisure.
So why do we work?
We work because we value the expected reward, the wage, the product, more than we value the leisure we give up. And the source notes, the more we work, generally, the greater the disutility feels. That last hour of work often feels tougher than the first.
Makes sense. You need to be paid enough to make it worthwhile.
Exactly. And here the source criticizes older economics for sometimes talking about labor as if it's all the same. It stresses that people and their abilities are vastly different. Wages aren't paid for some abstract quantity of labor. They're paid for the specific achievements of labor, which differ hugely in quality and quantity. You don't economize labor in general. You economize specific kinds of skilled or unskilled labor needed for a particular task.
So my wage reflects what the market thinks my specific contribution is worth.
That's the idea. Wage rates are determined by the interplay of the marginal productivity of that type of labor, how much it's expected to add to the final product's value, along with the supply of that labor, the availability of capital tools to work with, and the anticipated prices consumers will pay for the goods produced.
Okay, what about the common argument that capitalism exploits workers? That they're forced to accept low wages because they're weak?
The source tackles that head-on and calls it a fable. It argues that systematic exploitation, where entrepreneurs consistently pay workers less than they contribute, would require some kind of universal monopoly power over employing people, or maybe restricting who can become an entrepreneur. It claims this isn't feasible in a competitive market economy. Such widespread restriction, it argues, could really only happen institutionally, like under socialism, or if someone could somehow cartelize all factors of production, which is seen as practically impossible.
And the source's view on how capitalism has actually affected workers' lives.
It's a very positive. It asserts that the historical development of capitalism led to a massive multiplication of capital equipment, tools, machines, infrastructure, far outpacing population growth. And this resulted in a tremendous increase in the share of total output going to wage earners.
So living standards went way up.
Dramatically. The source calls the rise in living standards miraculous. It uses contrasts, like comparing the average modern worker's access to things like plumbing, heating, transport, communication, with the conditions faced even by a medieval lord. The argument is that the profit motive in a market system drives the most innovative minds to find ways to serve the needs and desires of the broad masses, because that's where the volume and thus the potential profit lies.
So the claim is capitalism uplifted the masses, not impoverished them.
That's the strong conclusion presented in the source, and it adds a point about differential rent. That's not just about land. Anyone controlling a superior resource, better land, a better tool, or even a more valuable skill earns a kind of rent compared to those using less productive resources. A surgeon earns a differential rent over a less skilled worker because their labor achieves a more highly valued result.
Time is another big factor Mises weaves in, isn't it? Especially with interest in capital.
Oh, absolutely. A really core concept is time preference. It's presented as just a fundamental aspect of human action. We value present satisfaction more highly than the same satisfaction in the future, all else being equal.
The cookie now versus the cookie later example.
Exactly. A good available now is worth more than the promise of the exact same good available only later. Present goods command a premium over future goods. And interestingly, the source argues that it's the very act of acting, which is always aiming at achieving something in the future, that gives us our practical understanding of time. Time isn't just clock watching, it's a category built into the structure of action itself.
What about the old idea that value comes from past labor? How much time went into making something?
The source completely rejects that from a praxeological standpoint. When you're deciding what to do now, the value of a good comes entirely from its expected ability to satisfy your future wants. The labor, the time, the resources sunk into it in the past. That's beside the point, part of the dead past. Those past costs are sunk. They don't determine today's value or tomorrow's price. It's the other way around. Expected future value helps you judge whether past costs were wisely incurred.
And connecting time to capital accumulation.
Right. Increasing the amount of capital goods, tools, machines, etc. is generally necessary if you want to adopt more roundabout production processes. These often take longer, involve more intermediate steps, but ultimately yield a higher output per unit of input. Think farming with a tractor versus a hand plow. But, the source notes, not all new capital necessarily requires longer processes. It depends on what consumers demand. And crucially, capital gets accumulated through saving, consuming less than you produce by individuals, not by some abstract collective.
What does the source say about international capital flows? Foreign investment.
It argues that for foreign investment to happen and be sustainable, the receiving countries need to have strong protection for private property rights and the rule of law. It suggests that historical instances of governments expropriating foreign investments effectively destroyed the trust needed for a robust international capital market and intergovernmental loans. They're seen as a poor substitute, often politically motivated, sometimes just disguised subsidies, and generally less efficient at allocating capital than private markets.
Does having more capital automatically mean interest rates go down?
Not necessarily the core originary interest rate, which reflects that fundamental time preference. The source suggests that just having more capital goods doesn't automatically make people less impatient or more willing to wait. The actual market interest rates, we see the gross rates, include other things too, like risk premiums and expected inflation. So while more capital might affect those components, it doesn't necessarily change the underlying preference for present over future goods.
Okay, monopoly. Often seen as a big market failure. How does this source approach it?
It makes a really important distinction right off the bat. There's having a monopoly being the single seller of something, and then there's being able to charge monopoly prices. They aren't the same thing.
So just being the only seller isn't enough.
Not enough to guarantee monopoly prices, no. Being the only seller is a necessary condition, sure, but you also need the demand curve for your product to have a specific shape. Specifically, it needs to be such that you can actually make more total profit by deliberately selling less product at a higher price compared to selling more product at the lower price the market would bear.
So you actually benefit from restricting supply below the competitive level.
Exactly. If lowering the price to sell more would increase your total revenue or profit, even a single seller wouldn't behave like a monopolist in this specific economic sense. They'd sell the larger quantity. Monopoly prices only emerge when restriction is more profitable than expansion.
What if you don't control 100% of the supply, but maybe like 80%?
The source says you can still potentially achieve monopoly prices in that situation if your share is large enough, and if the smaller competitors, the outsiders, don't just ramp up their own sales to fill the gap you create by restricting. The dominant firm has to shoulder the burden of the restriction.
The source is also known for being quite critical of using complex math to model monopoly.
Right. Very much so. It argues that while mathematical formulas can describe the theoretical conditions for maximizing profit under monopoly, if you already knew the exact shape of the entire demand curve.
Which you never do in reality.
Precisely. In the real world, an entrepreneur doesn't have that perfect information. They know past sales at past prices, maybe they can guess a bit about the near future, but they don't know the whole demand curve. So the source argues the mathematical approach, while perhaps elegant, is ultimately futile for guiding actual business decisions in the face of real-world uncertainty. It can describe a theoretical optimum, but it can't tell you how to find it in practice.
Let's talk about money, credit, and those booms and busts in the economy. What's the explanation offered in the source?
Okay, so the purchasing power of money, what it can buy, is determined, like other prices, by supply and demand. When people are acting, making decisions, they're interested in the future purchasing power of money, but they estimate that based on its purchasing power in the recent past.
And there was that point about how money first gets value, the regression theorem.
Yeah, the source briefly touches on that. The idea is that for something new to become widely accepted as money, it generally needs to have already had some value from other uses, like gold being used for jewelry or industry before it became money. People could then form expectations about its value, and its use as a medium of exchange adds a new component of demand and thus value on top of that pre-existing use.
How do changes in the money supply ripple through the economy? Is it even...
Definitely not evenly, according to the source. When the quantity of money changes, or the demand for holding money changes, the effects on individual prices happen unevenly, disproportionately, and sequentially. It's not like all prices instantly adjust by the same percentage. Some change faster than others, affecting different people and industries differently along the way.
There's also that claim that seems kind of counterintuitive about the quantity of money always being sufficient.
Right. The source argues that whatever quantity of money exists in an economy, it's always enough to perform all the functions that money needs to perform, facilitating exchange, calculation, etc. Changes in the quantity just change the purchasing power of each unit. They don't make the system fundamentally more or less able to function. It only redistributes wealth and income.
So an individual might feel short of cash, but the economy as a whole isn't.
Exactly. An individual fixes their personal shortage or surplus by changing their spending or earning. But for the whole system, the existing quantity is sufficient to make all necessary exchanges happen, just perhaps at a different level of prices. The only sense in which there's an excess or deficiency is from the perspective of people who stand to gain or lose from changes in money's purchasing power.
Okay, so if just having more money isn't the key, what about credit expansion? When banks create new money through lending...
This is where the source sees the primary driver of the business cycle, the boom and bust. When banks expand credit, creating new loanable funds beyond what people have actually saved, it can artificially push the gross market rate of interest below the rate that would reflect people's genuine time preferences and savings.
making borrowing seem cheaper than it should be, based on real resources.
Exactly. But critically, this credit expansion doesn't create more real capital goods, more factories, more machines, more raw materials. It just creates more monetary claims. So businesses get these misleading signals from the low interest rate.
Leading them to make bad investments.
That's the core argument. Malinvestment. They start projects that seem profitable at the artificially low interest rates, but which wouldn't be viable if interest rates reflected the true availability of saved resources. It's investment in the wrong lines, unsustainable projects. Not necessarily overinvestment in total, but investment directed incorrectly by the false price signal of cheap credit.
And this inevitably leads to a crash.
A bust.
Yes, inevitably, according to the source. Sooner or later, the reality hits. Either the lack of sufficient real capital goods becomes apparent, you can't finish a factory because the needed specialized equipment wasn't actually saved for, or rising prices and costs catch up as the new money works its way through, or the credit expansion stops and interest rates snap back. The malinvestments are revealed as errors, plants can't operate profitably, products can't be sold at expected prices.
And the recovery process, what's needed? The source argues the only way back is through adjustment. This involves new saving to accumulate the real capital that was lacking, probably a temporary restriction of consumption to allow for that saving, and adjustments in wages and prices to reflect the new, corrected structure of production. The source adds, pointedly, that if you don't like the pain of the bust, you shouldn't engage in the artificial boom created by credit expansion in the first place.
What about theories that blame cycles on other things, like psychology or sunspots or whatever, not money?
The source generally dismisses non-monetary theories of the cycle. It often argues they implicitly require believing that masses of experienced entrepreneurs suddenly become foolish or irrational all at once, making widespread errors that somehow the economic theorists can see clearly but the actors themselves cannot. It finds the monetary explanation, rooted in the distortion of calculation by credit expansion, more compelling.
Okay, finally, let's touch on what the source calls the crisis of interventionism.
Right. Interventionism is defined pretty simply. It's government interference with the otherwise functioning market economy. The source kind of describes a trajectory. You start with interventions. Maybe they seem to work initially, the harvest, but they deplete underlying resources or capital, the exhaustion of the reserve fund, and ultimately, the system either breaks down or has to move towards full central planning, the end of interventionism.
Why is interventionism viewed as inherently unstable or flawed in this framework?
The core argument is that it's logically inconsistent with how markets work. If prices are supposed to guide production based on supply and demand, then a government decree setting a price, like a price ceiling on rent, doesn't magically change the underlying reality. It just becomes a new piece of data the market reacts to.
Often in unintended ways.
Usually, yes. The rent ceiling doesn't make more apartments appear. It typically leads to shortages, deterioration of existing housing, black markets. It nullifies the market's signaling function.
So interventions tend to create new problems that then seem to call for more interventions.
That's the dynamic the source describes. One intervention creates distortions, which lead to calls for further interventions to fix the side effects of the first one, leading down a path further and further away from the market logic. The source also makes a direct link between interventionism, particularly protectionism, like tariffs, and conflict.
How so?
Protectionism is explicitly designed to harm foreign producers and benefit domestic ones at the expense of domestic consumers and foreigners. The source calls this mentality a philosophy of war, arguing that the international conflicts of the era were the logical outcome of nations pursuing these kinds of interventionist, beggar-thy-neighbor policies.
What about trying to fix market outcomes by appealing to people's morals? Asking businesses to be less greedy or consumers to buy ethically even if it costs more?
The source argues that's pretty much futile within a market system where consumers are sovereign. Businesses have to aim for profit to survive, which means serving consumer demands efficiently. Trying to get consumers to voluntarily act against their own perceived interests, like buying a more expensive, less efficient product out of social responsibility, is unlikely to work on a large scale. To make them do it would require coercion, government orders, which leads right back to the hegemonic command and control state, not the market.
And the flip side? Removing existing restrictions.
While putting up a restriction like a tariff might give a short-term boost to the protected industry, the source argues that removing restrictions, while potentially causing short-term pain for that specific group as they adjust, ultimately increases total output and benefits everyone in the long run by letting resources flow to their most productive uses, wherever they may be.
And there's a final contrast drawn between the welfare principle and the market principle.
Yes. The source criticizes advocates of the welfare principle for, in its view, often ignoring or even denying the fundamental need for capital accumulation through saving as the only way to achieve sustained economic progress and rising living standards for everyone. By promoting doctrines like the supposed dangers of oversaving, they are seen as advocating policies that actually lead to capital consumption, economic stagnation or retrogression, and ultimately spreading poverty, even if presented under the banner of achieving social justice by some arbitrary standard. The two approaches are seen as fundamentally opposed in their outcomes for general prosperity.
So the argument presented in the source is pretty stark. Any government meddling in the market, however well-intentioned it might seem, is ultimately unstable and leads away from prosperity and peace.
That is the very strong conclusion embedded in the source material, yes. Interventionism isn't seen as a sustainable middle way, but as a contradictory system that tends either to collapse under its own inconsistencies or necessitate a move towards full-blown socialism.
Wow. Okay, we have really covered a lot of ground here, digging into some absolutely core ideas from Mises' human action based on your sources.
We really have. We started with that bedrock concept, didn't we? Purposeful human action. How everything in this framework kind of flows from that.
Yeah, and how society itself isn't some separate thing, but emerges from all those individual actions, driven by the benefits of dividing labor and cooperating peacefully.
Then that absolutely critical discussion about economic calculation, why the source argues it's the compass, and why it insists it's impossible without real market prices for resources, posing that fundamental challenge to central planning.
Right, impossible calculation.
hmm
And then how the market, guided by consumers and their penny ballots, brings a kind of spontaneous order to production.
Consumer sovereignty, yeah. We also looked at value being subjective, about preference and choice, not measurement, and how prices come out of that interaction. Plus, the dynamics of labor, wages, and the source's strong stance on capital accumulation being key to rising living standards.
We touched on time preference, interest, the specific conditions needed for monopoly prices, not just monopolies, and that explanation of booms and busts tied to credit expansion and malinvestment.
And we wrapped up with that critique of interventionism, why the source sees it as inherently unstable, prone to failure, and ultimately detrimental.
It's definitely a complex system of thought presented in the source, but remarkably consistent, all stemming back to that initial idea of purposeful action. It offers a very specific lens for trying to understand our economic world.
Yeah, the source draws a really clear line, doesn't it? Between the market order based on voluntary cooperation, calculation, individuals pursuing ends, and these other systems, socialism or interventionism, which it argues run into fundamental logical or practical dead ends.
Which definitely leaves us and you, the listener, with something to think about. If human action truly is fundamentally about individuals purposefully using means to achieve their own ends, what does that imply about the best way to structure society? How can we best align our economic systems with that reality to allow for widespread well-being and cooperation? What stands out most to you from this deep dive?